Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us online. I'm Denise Reiner, Director Curator at OR Gallery, and this talk is in connection with our current exhibition, The Gas Imaginary, on view at OR Gallery from October 2nd through December 19th. I would like to acknowledge, first of all, that I'm speaking from Vancouver, Canada, a city located on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. I'm joined by Rachel O'Reilly, who is an artist, writer, poet, curator, and PhD researcher at Goldsmith Center for Research Architecture. She teaches the theory seminar at the Limits of the Writerly on planetary political economy and poetics at the Dutch Art Institute. And she is joining us from the Mbarntwa on Arund territory. Its colonial name is Alice Springs, Australia. And I'm also joined by Dr. Denise Ferreira da Silva, whose work addresses the ethical, poetical challenges of the global present. She is the author of multiple essays and publications, including Toward a Global Idea of Race, A Vida Impagable, Unpayable Debt, and with which she's a co-editor with Paula Chakravarty of Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime. And her artistic works include the films Serpent Rain and Four Waters' Deep Implicancy in collaboration with Arjuna Neumann. She also works on relational art practices such as poetical readings and sensing salon in collaboration with Valentina Desideri. And Denise joins us from her home on the Musqueam First Nation. Throughout the period over which Rachel O'Reilly developed her project, The Gas Imaginary, she's had ongoing conversations with many people, including Denise, who directly and through text, thinkers, and ideas that run throughout both of their work. So it's great to have them both here in conversation to discuss the ideas around the Gas Imaginary and the work that they're doing now. Thank you very much.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you, Denise, for the invitation to be part of the program and speak with Rachel. It is really very significant and important to talk about this work, especially as I speak, I live and now work in the Musqueam Reservation here in Vancouver. Rachel, as usual, is really amazing to be able to talk with you and about your work and and other things. I have a few questions that I would like to share and hear your response to them. But before I get to my obvious, and some of them probably very opaque questions, there is just something that came to me as I was reading your April 2018 essay on efflux, and the title of the essay is Dematerializations of the Land, Water, Object. And the essay opens with this, what I think is an image statement, and it's an image statement that to me runs through the exhibition, and it's it's a quote that you got from Geoscience Australia, and the quote goes like, "The unknown frontier is depth," and the unknown frontier is depth. Of course, it's related to fracking that we're looking at, but I think this brings out something that is in the drawings, in drawing nights, right? Sorry, the film, and then in fractions, but also in the drawings, in the exhibition, the timeline, the maps, the photos, all that comes together in the exhibition. And I like it. I responded to it because I found that it immediately brings what seems to be happening somewhere elsewhere over there, down under, as far away as Queensland and the Northern Territory in Australia, which are far away for somebody who lives in Melbourne. And then thinking here, also something as far away as Alberta and British Columbia, which seems like that for somebody who lives in Toronto, Canada. And then as far away as Amazonas and Mato Grosso, which are very far away for someone who lives in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And that's what is it about. Of course, it's about coloniality and extraction and the ongoing extraction and extinction that marks coloniality. So it is about the Coast GasLink pipeline now that's set to run through 190 kilometers of the unceded lands of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation here in BC. It is about the expansion of farming and mining in the Brazilian Amazon and the wetlands, which, again, expelling indigenous populations from the land. And in the case of our work, is about mining and fracking on Aboriginal lands in Australia. And I think I was attracted by it because, in a way, in a very, I think, appropriatedly mediated way, these words, they bring, they're the words of a government body, right? Not a person. And they immediately give out the stakes. The stakes, which to me are about the implications of policy with economic and the scientific. And this statement image shows how inseparable they are. And I think this is what your work is also showing, this exhibition is showing. And this is something that I would like to hear you maybe reflecting later, because my first question is a different one. But about what is it that you're doing? How do you do it? I find it is something that one could call an historic tracking of coloniality and raciality, but we'll hear you talking about it. I'll go back to that, later in our conversation. But before I go there, I have this obvious question for you, which is like, how did you came to this project? How did it come about? Where do you start? I don't know, what was the first question or first thing that came to you? If you could share it with us.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, for beginning in this way. I guess, so I grew up on Garang country on the East Coast in a small port town which has quite a significant relationship to the mineral wealth that gets exported from the north of the country. It was a huge coal port before it became a gas port. But I was particularly interested in, having grown up there and left there and working, as a moving image curator in the capital city about 6 hours away. I was going back there a lot. Actually, my dad was dying at the time, and I was just spending way too much time in town experiencing the very accelerated changes to the city as a result of the construction boom around the gas infrastructure. And my uncle was actually a union delegate on that construction site, but had been doing that work, on every previous major kind of modernist construction plant in the whole kind of state, as did my grandfather. So I kind of had a kind of informal understanding of the history of industry and how different this industry was, even in their understandings of extractive industry. But it was the thing that actually made me think about it aesthetically was going to some of the first community meetings after one of the biggest dredging projects in Australian history was put to work on the harbour to make the harbour deeper for the big gas ships. That the result of that dredging operation contaminated the harbour and upset, all of these layers of industrial toxins that were at the bottom of the harbour, and many fish died, turtles died, dugongs died. It was a huge kind of cover-up of causality. And so we were going to these community meetings and, sitting face-to-face with the consultants whose job it was to say that it wasn't a problem. And it was at that moment when, they explicitly said to us, you're the community, you're not going to get access to the science on this water monitoring. That's not your job because you're not trained scientists and it's been privatized anyway. And the kind of the level of the way in which they were using language and images that were deeply unscientific to cover up, the degree, the plan, the future plan that was also extremely vague as a kind of operating plan. It was that relationship between, anti-empiricism and ambitious extraction that I found super interesting, as processes of real abstraction on the corporate side. And just as a settler, that the language that you have for your landscape is extremely violent already, because you don't know the local language for the materiality of the landscape. And then to see the kind of next layer of capitalization of that poverty-stricken language achieve so much in such a short period of time. I think that was my, as someone with a literature background, that was how I kind of really had an immediate reaction to what, to the kinds of operations that these approval processes use and need to kind of rematerialize people's understanding of what's happening very, very quickly. So, I kind of started writing poetry as a result of going to that community meeting for the first time in 20 years. And then the poems kind of turned into, I wanted to write a book, and then I just couldn't write the book because I didn't have a single empirical fact that could go into the book that was provable in a court of law, because all of it was inaccessible, basically. So it kind of turned into an art project because it was not obvious that I could do anything else at that point in relationship to what was going on.
Amazing. It's interesting that what called your attention, what seems to have grabbed you, is precisely the poverty of the symbolic in that. And then at the same time, I'm thinking the symbolic in terms of the language being poor, but also the lack of scientific evidence, which is obviously one would expect of these partnerships between the state and when it's opening up to corporations. But you said something as a settler, right? As growing up as a settler in that space. One of the things that I could not notice or perceive, I should say, is how, for instance, in Infractions in the film, we don't see you, right? I mean, I think in Infractions we see you. I think it's you fishing. Is that you?
That's me fishing.
We see your back, so those of us who know you know it's you. And but still, you're very present. And I think it's not only because of your voice over in Drawing Rights or you asking questions in Infractions. And that presence, absence, you've been there. Of course, you are there in other ways, but these more direct ways. So that made me wonder about two things. On the one hand, it made me wonder about how the settler, the figure of the settler, and that here in particular the white Australian, thinking of that figure as a political figure, as an economic and legal, juridic, colonial, racial figure, how that figure comes across, in the work, and so it's not about how you want to portray that figure if you're presenting the figure. I don't think that you do that, but I can see the figure there being hailed somehow, being interpolated. And I think that, that's a moment of production, even though it's not, identified this way. So anyway, so now that you get to this moment in the work, as it's being, the exhibitions are here. So do you have a sense of how he, she, they come across? Maybe, I don't know, from your point of view or somebody else who is looking at the work, or other folks, white or, Black, Indigenous, people of color, Australian. And so, and then of course, if you never thought about it, and if you don't find it interesting, you don't have to answer the question. I'm just, and then of course, if you don't, you can tell me why you wouldn't answer the question. But I'm interested in that.
Yeah, no, I think about this a lot. So, you know, there's multiple beginnings of this project. Another beginning, there's about 5 beginnings, but another beginning, what, you know, is the fact that when the fracking industry installed itself here, the first drills, the first rigs that were kind of set up, it went to some of the whitest agricultural farmlands in southwest Queensland, and the history of those pastoral areas is extremely violent, but also extremely well known as a space of guerrilla resistance, like pan-Aboriginal resistance to pastoral expansion. And at the time, you know, the first anti-fracking activist films and organising was all about, you know, this figure of the white farmer losing his, you know, his Australian dream once the corporations invaded after 1989, as if we had no corporations before 1989 in the country. So I was really interested in, you know, I'm not sure I would have been so ambitious about this work pedagogically if there wasn't actually such a strong resistance movement to the industry. But the fact is that it was the biggest environmental movement, you know, of the neoliberal era, I think you could say. And it was also the, you know, like the whitest, you know, in many years. So I really felt it was kind of an interesting moment as someone who, you know, was working in an art museum curating First Nations, the integrity of First Nations practices and doing that kind of cultural work. You know, 1 hour away, people were having this kind of totally ahistorical story of injustice that was all hooked to the idea of private property and the disintegration of private property. And I think that, you know, that figure keeps appearing throughout as the kind of conceptual beginning that needs to be deconstructed. And I think by the time it gets to infractions, you know, people were, you know, it makes a difference to the early work and that early kind of resistance movement that the state where I grew up has the weakest First Nations land rights in the country. And so, you know, that kind of pedagogical kind of work around colonisation was totally obvious and totally absent. But once you get to the Northern Territory, there are stronger First Nations land rights. And it's also not my context. Like, I haven't spent much time here. So, you know, there's a kind of level of humility that also, you know, is part of it. But I think, you know, particularly when I showed it in Germany, there's such a strong history of, you know, kind of radical essay film coming from, you know, the critique of labour and industry that's fully inside of kind of industrial imagination. People really wanted this kind of attention to the mode of production to include my voice and include my body and include more of me, like dominating the material. And so I kind of put myself fishing in there to say, well, this is, you know, this is the space that I come from, and this is my literacy. It comes from, you know, my father had a fishing shop, so he got all the gossip from about the mining companies just from sitting on the floor of his fishing store and talking to people. And that was my informal kind of capitalist education or industry education. And it's there, I think it's there in the film, and it's there in the way that I introduce myself to people, which enabled those conversations to happen. But it's just not, to me, it's just not that interesting to put that material in the film. And so I think, you know, the Infractions has a much more kind of modest figuration of the settler, but Drawing Rights is really like aims really hard at that figure to really explain, you know, like how it's even possible that we aren't talking about the whiteness of private property when we're talking about fracking resistance, anti-fracking movements.
Here I am. Okay, now, yeah, it's interesting because, yeah, that's actually my kind of like following. It's a follow-up, but it is a question that came to me before, which is, the infractions is very intimate, right? Even though there is this absence of you in the camera, you're very close to the people you're talking to, and I felt very close to them. And that happened at the same time as we have the split screen, and then you have, like the militant. There is one militant side, some on one side, and then there is that close connection, which I think it works very nicely because the one side of the screen gives us a kind of information that is crucial for, to those who don't know much about the context. Helps to locate the person with whom you're talking, interviewing, what they narrate, describe, comment on. So it is a documentary, but it's not, right? It's not the kind of militant documentary, and it's something else. So can you say more about your choices there? How did you put those pieces together? I was thinking something else. I was thinking about, so like sound. I think there is only music at the end, which is like live music. So that and as a viewer, to me that brought me, made it more intimate actually. But I don't know. So can you comment on this perception of film?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was also, I mean, on the one hand, I'd never made a film before, and this is the first time I'd held a camera, and I, I didn't know what I was doing for a bunch of reasons, but also because I refused to know what I was doing before I spoke to all those people about what they might want me to film. So we had these interesting moments where, like I should apply to the Land Council and give them a map of all the places that I wanted to film, and it was a bit of a standoff because I was like, I'm not going to give you a map until I've spoken to this woman about what she wants me to film from her own country, So on the one hand, it was purposefully unplanned in lots of ways, and really the interviews. The first trip that I made 2 trips before I filmed anything, and then the first trip that I made filming was literally interviewing people and me thinking based on the interviews I might figure out what the film would be, because it was really their experience of enduring this kind of ongoing investment imaginary that I wanted to capture, from the grassroots of their country, as cultural workers, as the unpaid cultural workers of this country, and I guess I didn't actually know, even after that trip, that the film would be mostly composed of interviews. But once we sat down in the editing room with my wonderful editor, Sebastian Badersky, I realized that the entire story was in about four people, and if we just kind of edited it properly, that was the film. And then it required certain footnotes, and he was really useful for kind of not interrogating me, but asking me questions to explain certain things. And then once we kind of did that together, the footnotes on the side, they were also initially, there was a question about whether there was going to be a voiceover. So the footnotes on the side are really avoiding a voiceover and trying to kind of sit back a bit, so that if you know enough about the kind of legal history, you actually don't really need to read those footnotes. And the faciality of the people is really the main thing carrying you along. The music, it's funny, I filmed, because these people are constantly organizing. So I was kind of following around in a 4-wheel drive, and Adrian just rang me and he said, "Hey, we're playing at Desert Harmony. Why don't you come and film that?" And so I went and filmed, they played about 6 songs at that amazing festival in the middle of the desert. And then when they played that particular song, I knew that was the end of the film, because I had no way of ending this film, which is right in the middle of a political campaign. And when I heard that, the hair kind of bristled on the back of my neck, and I knew that at least we had an ending, because it's just such a powerful song, and their band does such important work communicating you know, across different territories and doing quite diplomatic work in that sense.
No, yes, well, it brought me. You have answered my following my following question, which was exactly about the interviews and how, you know, and how the conversations actually, in a way, whether and how they, as you said, I mean, you have answered that, but I found that Dr. Irene Watson's initial framing was quite powerful in different ways. It wasn't more powerful than that of the other activists, you know, because they all are. I think it was Jack Green who said something about money equals dead land. Was it him?
It was Gadrian, yeah.
Oh, Gadrian, yeah.
At the end.
That was, oh my God, it's like, it's amazing. So that moment, I mean, these what Dr. Watson is talking about in terms of, you know, that is the Australian state law, and then Aboriginal law, and also kind of an internationalism that she's talking about. So I was wondering, I mean, has it? Do you think that now that you finished the film, you've made, and then have the exhibition made all this work, do you think that this has it become something? I mean, I think I'm asking whether the ways in which Dr. Watson is in the film, does it reflect something that came to you as you have been doing the work, or something that you knew intuitively? I wonder if you could say, you know, think in terms of the different laws, and then it's important to say also that the Aboriginal conception of law is very much tied to culture. There is no separation, right? I mean, it's tied also to existence, unlike, you know, the Western one. So I don't know if you don't have to answer this either.
The question is about the legal critique.
Yeah, about Irene Watson's you know, framing, because I felt like, in a way, as you're going back to her, in a way, she was providing us with something, and I was wondering if it is something that you always saw as significant, especially thinking of the white Australian, right, or if it is something that came out of the work.
Yeah. Yeah, her book is actually being read by some of the organizers as a result of this film. So you know, I wanted Irene to be in there as well, because it was, you know, it's not just a local production. It launched in Europe, and I didn't want the film to create kind of theoretical opportunities for people that weren't First Nations legal theorists. But aside from that, you know, I think you know, art space is often a terrible place for thinking about political organizing, but it is a good space for thinking about form and abstraction. And I think that happens more. I still think, you know, Australian art schools teach very New York histories of art. And if we're talking about abstraction, like, I think those are the abstractions that I think we need to be thinking about in Australian art spaces. And I think, you know, my hunch is that, you know, there's three particular abstractions, and one, you know, the first is terra nullius, the second is Torrens tidal, which in drawing rights I referenced that I was reading a lot of Brenna Bandar's work at that time, and Ranisa Malwani and Sarah Keenan, to think through, you know, the whiteness of private property. But the third one, and the reason I think that Irene Watson was, you know, welcome to talk to me about this project, is because I have been paying a lot of attention to the abstractions that make up the corporate form, you know, the deep history of finance. And I think there's a certain kind of illiteracy in the kind of white left or progressive left in Australia that's not Indigenous around the relationship of corporations to racism and the production of, you know, the ongoing production of race through the corporation. And, you know, if I'm contributing something, it's trying to put that into conversation with all the First Nations critiques that exist of the other abstractions. The city where I grew up, you know, at one point in time, I think it's been kind of owned entirely by a single mining company. So at the moment, it's Shell. It used to be Rio Tinto. Before that, it was Comalco, an American company. And from just that kind of layered history of the reputation of those companies, you get a history of like labor deregulation, but you also get a kind of first-hand story of how each of those corporations have related to First Nations employment, First Nations, you know, legal struggles. And I don't, you know, like, I think there's just not enough, in particularly in the cultural industry. I mean, it kind of shocks me that we're cultural workers and we don't know the impact of corporations on, you know, on the culture where we work. So I think that was, yeah, I feel like that was my internal conversation with Irene, but the actual conversation, you know, was me thinking about how much she could contribute to, you know, like being the kind of authoritative narrative between all these different locations, because it's not, you know, it's a kind of post-invasion possibility that, you know, lets me move around with a camera and connect all these stories up. And I think, you know, her story of the connectivity of country was much more important to kind of platform the connectivity between people.
Well, definitely. And I think what something else that I see, and then I was referring to it at the beginning, is also precisely how you bring out this that relationship between the state and the corporations, right? In particular, because the state actually owns, right, the subsoil, what's underground, and then what is at stake there. So it's not about private property, which is usually one way through which we engage in that critique, but it's directly about the state and its ability to really take the land out of, you know, indigenous peoples, you know, off their feet, literally, without, and then developing out these very close relationships with corporations. So I think, yeah, you bring the corporation, but you also bring the state back into the conversation. And I think the colonial, the ways in which, you know, coloniality as a mode of governance remains so crucial to global capital. And that's why I want to call attention to the fact that it's playing out here, it's playing out in Brazil, I mean, in all different places, and your work brings it together so painfully and beautifully too. It's a combination. Yes, okay, I'll stop.
A question, you know, for me is, you know, particularly because, you know, it's a kind of research work that's connected to land defences, right? To those people's sovereignty. So there's only so many ways I can appropriately, you know, display it, and I'm constantly, you know, updating people on what's happening, and the, you know, the film tour includes a budget for First Nations speakers in every location, and it's trying to land well, but also continue to get permission to exhibit it. And if people don't think it's meaningful to exhibit it anymore, then I won't, you know. But at the moment, you know, the general reaction is basically that the film should be seen more broadly, and so I'm trying to think about you know, what avenues there are, and then I have to think about publicity in a way that I've never thought about. Publicity, and publicity probably is the wrong word, but, you know, networks of breaching a kind of more general or popular or, you know, educational audience that requires a whole lot of strategy around distribution and things like that. So in the sense, I'm really experiencing the limits of art space just because it is such a political film, but also, the reason I made the film like that is because I know that, films like this don't go on television. They don't necessarily get into film festivals. And so the art space becomes this kind of residual space of public, deliberation or mediation that, symptomatically plays a role it doesn't, just because of how kind of obliterated the media is by a kind of corporate disintegration, of the public media space.
Yes, but the film. So there are the art spaces and the classrooms. I was thinking I so wanted to show the film to my students, and it's both because to talk about its the political content of the film, but also the ethical decision to do. To put the film together in the way you did, right? There is a risk in doing it, but then there is a decision in doing it, and in a way, I feel like you let the viewer kind of decide how she positions herself in relationship to the film. So. It may be because the 4 people did do, what they were supposed to do in there. But yeah, it's difficult. I don't know. What do you think, Denise?
Myself. Yeah, sorry. I was just making notes. I wasn't expecting to be brought back in the conversation. I think I've sort of been paying attention to how people view the work in the gallery, and of course there is this difference in space and not having the connection that I think those in IMA at the IMA in Brisbane would. But there's immediately in the conversations I've had with viewers a recognition of the connection with BC and I think most of the people, again, because OR is an artist-run space, that end up in the gallery have had, either direct activism to do with the protests against the pipelines and fracking and what's going on here, and so they kind of, I guess, immediately think that they're not trying to be convinced by the work, but just trying to find, similarities, and kind of connect with this idea of, well, just where we are with our own discussions on sovereignty and the different political situation with First Nations and having treaties and land rights that are quite vastly different from Australia. So that's maybe where I think the viewers are kind of finding that how they're being addressed is like, okay, this is the information that I'm picking up rather than anything about like environmentally. They're already on board and just from observations.
I'm having difficulties trying to convey that, but I think Denise, you did that by precisely by describing how people are responding to the exhibition, which is, it is maybe we can call it an abstract in the good sense, but there is an abstract political space configuration that the film identifies, that then it's no longer about who is saying what when or who is doing what when, but it's actually that common, not universal, but common commonality. And then so that's why I was thinking about here and thinking about Brazil immediately as I'm looking at the film, and I think that's what we need more than the mere inclusive gesture, which is what I was thinking about when I was answering your initial question, Rachel. There is a gesture of inclusion that seems like it's political, but it's so totally liberal, right? I mean, okay, let's open up. But that is more to be done, and that means to create a space where everyone has to take a position in relationship to a political situation, right? Which is racial and colonial.
I think the hardest part is knowing when you've done enough research in one direction to kind of make the argument that kind of pulls back into the rest of the picture, and that's also why it took so long. But yeah, it took so long because it that the thing hasn't stopped being a problem. But I think with infractions it was. I think I've said all that I can possibly say about how ridiculous this kind of infrastructure is, because it does just cross a border and repeat the same story from the side of its operations. And so I guess, that once it crossed that border from into the Northern Territory, I felt like I wanted to cross the border with it and do something against the repetition of the violence of what it repeats, I guess. So yeah, and then the connectivity, the way that the Northern Territory is used, against First Nations people also on the East Coast, that's also part of the story. The cutting.
Can you say more about it?
Well, I mean, working in the cultural industry, there's still a hunger for a certain kind of aesthetic capturing of relationships to land that gets aestheticized in certain kinds of paintings that sell much higher than in the last 2 decades, political Aboriginal art has definitely, reached an international audience also in terms of sales, I guess. But it's still, the majority of wealth that gets extracted from culture is white people trading other white people's collections of Aboriginal art, and when there's an entire industry that's designed to do that, and no kind of interest from that industry in saying anything about the destruction of the country from which all those paintings come from. I think that's also, that was also my interest in thinking about like that. If that is the work that we're all somehow entangled with, how can we use the art industry to actually talk more about that, given that it's already such an exploitative space, and then the people that make the most money from that aestheticization of country are saying absolutely nothing about the threats to that country. And I think that, that is quite a kind of remarkable degree of complicity, I think.
I think that connects to what Denise put in the chat. Not Denise about the material, abstraction, extraction, dematerialization. But that is asking you to talk about the drawing and the wall drawing in relation to the works for mapping and connecting the materialization. I know you can see the question, but
yeah, I thought, it wasn't. I just thought, if the film is an hour long and it purposefully is slow moving through people's land, it will take people a while to figure out that they want to watch it or not. And just putting that map on the wall, it kind of, it's whatever it's representing, it's quite a shocking amount of space, on that continent. And so if people kind of see the map and they've never seen a map before with that amount of mineral licenses on it, I don't think, because the people that follow this stuff, follow it intensely, and then if you're not keeping up, you kind of don't follow it at all. Like, you just have a vague understanding that something's happening outside of the capital cities, and that's it. So I wanted to, it's actually quite a scary image, but I also make it really clear that half of it is completely fictional. So the yellow spaces have been approved, but they're not necessarily being fracked. So they've been approved for fracking, but not necessarily being fracked. and then the blue spaces are places where a mining company has very easily submitted an application to the government to say, I would like to be the company that has the rights to frack there. But in some of those places, there isn't even any minerals underground. It's just how easy it is to lodge an application. So they smothered the Northern Territory up to 80% of the land with mineral applications once the kind of shale boom took off in the US. And it's only in the last, it's only since 2014, I think, that the land councils have come back and said, well, actually, like, you're creating a lot of work for us with how easy it is to submit these applications. So, let's get real about where the actual gas is. So it gives you an idea of how easy it is to mine the country, because if you get on the internet, I think any layperson can actually just log in and look at a kind of mineral prospecting website to see, what's available for extraction. And I think that's the degree of access for that kind of speculation is quite exaggerated here, I think.
So two things. So, but then the companies pay, right? The government when they apply. So there's a source of revenue.
Yeah, if the companies pay for the license to extract, and so the government gets income from that. But most of these companies pay zero tax, and most of the actual gas, like when the first approvals happened, there was no domestic reserve policy. So even all the gas that's being extracted from the country goes offshore, and there's no promise that the company will give any gas to the domestic market. And it's under the principle of the shortage that comes from the totality of exports from the first approvals that there's a fiction that there's a gas shortage, and so the rest of the country is supposed to frack their gas because all of the gas on the East Coast is going to the kind of Asian market.
So they, when this place where they buy the license, but then nobody knows if there's gas, there is always the possibility of something being there that they can extract, one could think.
Yeah, technically that's a real space of contention, because technically they're not allowed to change their mind about what they're extracting, and they should apply for a new license. But some of the early approvals of gas licenses were old licenses laid out for something else, or for conventional gas mining, for example. There's a first case, the Butchulla people in the Waidbury area in central Queensland, just below Gladstone. It was the first case in Australia where First Nations won the cancelling of old licenses based on free, prior, informed consent. They said that they hadn't been consulted about the new form of the industry. I think they were old conventional gas licenses, and they won. They won that. It was a new precedent in terms of international law, but hopefully it will have some impact on some other cases. But so far, that's the only instance where people have been successful in getting those old licenses outmoded.
And how about water, underground water? How much of it is in that part of Australia? I'm asking because I was in Texas, in Marfa, which is southwest Texas, and it's a region with lots of fracking, right? I mean, the ranchers making even more money with fracking, and but it's also but fracking is taking place in one of the largest, I forgot the term you use, like there's lots of water there, like I think most of the water in the US is in there. So how's it called? I can't remember. But anyway, but what I found, the thing that amazed me is how little control the US government office that supposedly monitors it, and how they do it, which is basically there is a little instrument which says if there was contamination, but then if that happens, all the water will be destroyed. But my question in regards to Australia has to do with the fact that I'm just wondering if there is also water in these places where with the blue, the blue areas in the map.
I mean, the water is the main story, really. So fracking is very water intensive, and it's it's unprecedented in how water intensive it is. So they need to go to a place where there's underground water to use the water as a kind of tool, which they put chemicals into to create more pressure for the drilling, and then they use clean water to toxify the land essentially, and then that toxic water is waste that they still don't know how to deal with it because it's too expensive to fully reprocess. But the story, obviously the water was already over extracted from the pastoral industry, and then over the top of that story, the mining companies, not just the fracking industry, but most mining companies get free water licenses. So the pastoral industry gets very, very upset that the miners get free water and they have to kind of trade water. But the whole idea of privatized water trading came from US consultancies in the early 1980s and was sold to the Australian government as a way to deal with increased industry. So that model was used on the East Coast to create like a water market between farmers and mines on the East Coast. And it's already sent the Murray-Darling river system dry. It's a complete disaster. And the same people that are managing that are now planning to privatise and trade the water in the Northern Territory, not just for fracking, but also for big mega cotton farms.
Yeah. I was wondering. So they may not do any fracking, but they have access to the underground water in there.
Well, I think they need to do what they say they're doing, but I think the risk to water is the kind of general part of the story, and it is quite wild because it's such a like the water in the Northern Territory, it comes from a kind of the El Nino system that hovers. I mean, you've kind of did a bit of thinking around this with Arjuna, I think, but the El Nino system is not an annual water system. It's like 4 or 5 year drought that then turns into a flood, and then the desert completely floods. And the settler kind of imagination gets very upset that water dribbles down into the underground system rather than gets captured by dams and farms. And so this fantasy of stealing the water from the desert is actually a 19th century idea. Like as soon as people saw how the desert was flooding, it became this story of capture that's existed, and been abandoned for how kind of farcical it is to kind of program and manage that degree of ancient and very wild flooding and monsoonal and underground flows. I think there's a moment in the film where you look on the left-hand side, there's this really analog image of underground water right next to a spring that's at risk of fracking, and then you see, like right over the top of that are all these kind of ambitious mining plans, and their way of dealing with threats to the underground water flow is to put a barrier of 2 kilometres around major cities and towns, and the whole kind of First Nations literacy is about the connectivity of all those places and how to find water in all those places from the underground system. And so the relationship of that level of ambition to a total kind of lack of empiricism, I just find really like negatively fascinating, just because of how much they won't control, and the plans, the fracking rigs and the waste ponds, that they're not going to even cover those, and so they're just going to be massively flooded if they put those waste ponds there.
But it's also this the thing about the frontier, right? Is a frontier, but it's not one for settlement. Makes me think of the Amazon in Brazil. There is no settlement. There is only extraction, and then of course, and then the waste and the destruction stays with the indigenous population, right? It's I think that's what we see happening again more intensively than for a while industrial capital was leading the thing. Wasn't so intense or so obvious, but now seems to be so obvious because the computers and need minerals, right? I mean, you need all kinds of things to have this virtual life that we do. But yeah, that aspect, which again brings back, I think, that relationship, that this intimacy between these corporations and the state, in which, you know, the state allows them to do things, serves their interests, but that doesn't have any obligation to protect them, because they are not in there. But then when doing so, the state is obviously failing to protect, you know, its territory, which is then I don't know, there is a shift in the state and in that strategic economic connection, which I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the point about settlement, like historically, it has been a place of frontier settlement, and there are, you know, pastoral properties on some of the driest land, you know, in the Northern Territory. So I think what's what you're pointing to is, you know, the difference of the moment is also, you know, the politicians that are making it easy for the corporations to do this, or you know, the degree of state power that's making it easy, is surprising, you know, settler citizenship, because there is just this assumption that, you know, it was settled as a frontier and a new frontier will come along and unsettle it, and people just move where the money is, and leaving First Nations people to, you know, to defend their country. So I think there is this fantasy that, you know, it will develop, you know, it's a sacrifice zone fantasy. And I think it surprises me that it surprises settlers, you know, to be in that space that has been a differently organized sacrifice zone, where it's just reorganizing itself so that they can't live there anymore. And that's when they're starting to think about corporate power and calling it, you know, foreign ownership, when actually the history of the country is a history of foreign ownership, you know.
The whole notion of ownership is foreign, right? I mean, that's what inflection introduces very nicely.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Denise, for that conversation. It's really great just to hear, as always, two people that are intelligent and really aware of each other's work and have been thinking alongside and together for a while to talk and just to sit in and listen in I've enjoyed it very much. So thanks again.